For years, I stayed silent. I carried this story buried deep inside me, like a wound that never fully healed, like a prayer I was too afraid to speak out loud. Every night I would close my eyes and hope the memories would fade, that the pain would finally leave my body, but it never did. Because what happened to me inside that convent wasn't just a mistake. It was a crime. A sin committed by someone who wore the cloth of holiness but acted like a redditor. And today, I'm finally ready to say it. I know that, for many people, the image of a convent is one of peace, of devotion, of women who gave up everything to serve God. And yes, that was my dream. I wanted to dedicate my life to something greater than myself. I believed in purity, in prayer, in salvation. I believed that if I gave my soul completely, I would find healing. But instead, I found pain. I found betrayal. I found silence. The kind of silence that screams inside you when no one wants to hear the truth. I'm not telling this story for pity. I don't want sympathy. I'm telling it because someone needs to. Because maybe there's another woman out there right now, going through the same thing I went through. And maybe she thinks she's alone. Maybe she thinks God abandoned her. But He didn't. He never did. It was men who failed her. Just like they failed me. And I need her to know. Your voice matters. Your pain is real. And you are not alone. This is the story of how I entered a sacred place, looking for peace. And instead, lost a part of myself, that I will never get back. This is the story of how I was abused by the very man who claimed to guide me to heaven, and how they made me erase the life that came from it. A life I never got the chance to hold. A child I never got to love. And a truth I'll never let them bury again. Asterisk, I was only 18 when I entered the convent. Barely a woman, still clinging to the fragments of a childhood shaped by guilt, discipline, and the hope that devotion could somehow save me from the chaos I was born into. My family was strict, conservative, and deeply religious. My father used to say that girls like me, too soft, too curious, too emotional, needed strong walls around them. He believed the convent would straighten my soul. And in my desperation to make him proud, I believed it too. The moment I stepped through those heavy wooden gates, something inside me shifted. I wasn't afraid. I was relieved. I thought I was entering a holy sanctuary, a place where the world's noise would fall away. Where I could become something sacred. The sisters greeted me with serene smiles, their eyes calm, their voices low. They welcomed me like family. I remember thinking, maybe this is where I finally belong. I had no idea how wrong I was. In those first weeks, everything felt like a ritual. The early morning prayers, the stillness of the chapel, the soft echo of footsteps on stone floors. Silence wasn't just encouraged, it was expected. And I embraced it. I wanted to disappear inside it. The silence felt like safety. But looking back now, I see it differently. It was the silence that kept us trapped. The silence that allowed so many things to happen, right in front of our eyes, without anyone daring to speak. I was obedient. I prayed harder than anyone. I fasted. I kept my eyes low. I smiled when they told me to smile, and cried only in secret. I wanted to be the perfect sister. I wanted to be accepted. And maybe, just maybe, I wanted to be loved. But in that place, love was not the kind you read about in holy books. In that place, love could be twisted, disguised, and weaponized. I would soon learn that not all men who wear a collar walk with God. Some carry darkness behind their smiles, and I was about to meet one of them. He arrived one afternoon during Mass, wearing that long black cassock and a silver cross that shimmered with authority. Everyone seemed to respect him instantly. The older sisters whispered his name like it carried weight. He wasn't our usual priest, he was a visiting confessor, sent from another diocese, supposedly to help guide the younger sisters. I remember the first time I saw him. His voice was calm, his gaze intense, and his presence unsettling. But I ignored that feeling. I had been taught to trust, taught to obey, especially men of God. He called me by name that first day, even though I had never met him before. "Sister Clara," he said softly, like he'd been waiting to speak to me. I felt flattered. Seen. I didn't know that predators often start by making you feel special, that their charm is a mask. He asked if I was settling well into convent life. I nodded, awkward but polite. Then he smiled and said, "You'll need confession soon, won't you? It's important to keep your soul clean." And just like that, he planted the seed, a reason to be alone with me. Days passed, and he began to linger after prayer. At first it was harmless, a compliment about how devoted I seemed. A quiet comment about my voice during hymns. A light touch on my shoulder when he walked past me in the corridor. Nothing I could call wrong, but just enough to make me uncomfortable. I told myself it was in my head, that I was overreacting, that he was just being kind. But deep down, something felt off. There was a chill behind his words, like something he wasn't saying out loud. Then came the first confession. I sat behind the screen, hands folded, heart pounding. I confessed my usual sins: doubt, distraction, pride. He listened quietly. Then he asked if I had been tempted by fleshly feelings. I froze. I hadn't mentioned anything like that. But he pressed gently, almost tenderly, telling me that many young sisters struggle with impure thoughts. I didn't know how to answer. I felt ashamed just hearing those words in that space. And that's when I realized, he wasn't guiding me, he was testing how far he could go. And I had just stepped into his trap. After that first confession, everything changed. He started calling me in more often, sometimes twice a week, sometimes more. Always under the same pretext, spiritual guidance. But these weren't the kind of confessions I'd been taught growing up. He asked questions that made my skin crawl. Questions about my body, about whether I ever felt desire, about dreams I'd had. I remember one time, I hesitated to answer, and he leaned in closer, his voice lowering like a secret. There's no shame in temptation, Sister Clara. It's what we do with it that matters. But I could tell it wasn't concern. It was curiosity. And it wasn't holy. At first I thought maybe he was trying to help me. I was young, confused, inexperienced. Maybe I was misunderstanding. But each time, his words grew bolder. He began to describe scenarios instead of asking. Sometimes, he'd close the screen between us and whisper so close to it that I could feel his breath. These thoughts are natural, he'd say. God created your body. Why should you be ashamed of it? My body would freeze, my hands clench. I didn't know what to say. I felt dirty just listening, but too afraid to speak up, too afraid to accuse a priest. He started showing up outside of confession to watching me during chores, lingering in doorways. Once, he brushed his hand across my back when no one was looking, whispering, "You're doing so well, Clara. Keep your heart open to the Spirit." But his touch burned. I didn't tell anyone. I couldn't. The other sisters revered him. And besides, what could I say? That a priest was making me feel unsafe during confession. That he was saying things no priest should ever say. Who would believe me? I barely believed myself then. One night he asked to see me after evening prayer in his private room. I remember standing outside the door, my hands shaking. I told myself, maybe it was nothing. Maybe he just wanted to pray. But as soon as I stepped inside and the door clicked shut behind me, I knew something was terribly wrong. The air was heavy, the curtains drawn, and he wasn't wearing his clerical collar. He smiled, softly, and said, "You don't have to pretend anymore. I know what you feel. God understands. Let me help you surrender your guilt." And that was the moment I stopped being a nun and became his prey. I don't remember every second of that night. Some memories my mind has buried, like a defense. Others are crystal clear, burned into me with unbearable clarity. I remember how my knees buckled when he came closer. How my voice tried to say no but got stuck somewhere in my throat. I remember the way he spoke calm, measured, like this was a holy act. Like he was saving me from something. He told me to offer myself, fully, to let go of shame, and that God would understand. But nothing about what he did felt sacred. It felt violent. It felt wrong. And when it was over, I didn't feel purified. I felt ruined. I couldn't sleep that night. I sat on the cold stone floor of my cell, trembling, praying, no, begging, for God to make it not real, to erase it. But morning came, and with it, silence. He passed by me during breakfast, smiling gently, as if nothing had happened, as if the pain in my body was just part of my imagination, and I smiled back. Not because I wanted to, but because I was afraid. Because inside that convent, he wasn't just a priest. He was powerful, protected, and I was nobody. The days that followed were a blur. I kept my head down, avoided him when I could, and tried to lose myself in prayer. But he kept calling me back for confession, for clarity, for spiritual comfort. I started to feel like I was living in two bodies, one that followed the rules and sang the hymns, and another that was broken, used, and dying, quietly inside. I wanted to run, to scream, to tell someone. But the fear of being accused of lying, of being branded a seductress or a sinner, kept me paralyzed. Weeks passed, then a month, and then, I missed my cycle. At first, I dismissed it, thinking maybe it was stress or exhaustion. But deep down, I knew before I even said it out loud. I was pregnant. Pregnant by a man who was supposed to be my spiritual guide. Pregnant in a place where motherhood, outside of the Virgin Mary, was considered a disgrace. I held my stomach in the dark and whispered, "I'm so sorry." Not to myself, but to the life that was now growing inside me. A life that I already feared wouldn't be allowed to exist. I tried to hide it at first. I wore my habit looser. I skipped meals, claiming nausea. I avoided the infirmary. But I could feel it, my body was changing, and so was my soul. I'd sit in the chapel late at night with my hand pressed against my belly, praying in silence, not for forgiveness, but for strength. For the strength to protect that tiny heartbeat growing inside me. I whispered to my child, promising I'd never let anything happen to them. That somehow, I would find a way to keep them safe. But deep down, I knew this place wasn't safe for either of us. Eventually, I couldn't hide it anymore. One morning after prayer, the Mother Superior called me into her office. Her tone was sharp. Her eyes didn't blink. "You've gained weight, Sister Clara," she said, coldly. "Is there something you need to confess?" My mouth went dry. I wanted to deny it, but my lips refused to move. The silence between us stretched. Then she leaned in, lowered her voice, and said words I will never forget. "We've had this problem before. It must be taken care of quickly, quietly, for the good of the Church." I tried to speak, to explain, to beg, but she wasn't listening. She didn't ask who the father was. She didn't ask how I felt. She didn't even flinch. It was as if I'd told her I had a stain on my robe, something to be washed away, erased. She handed me a small vial of liquid and said, "You will drink this tonight. No one must ever know. This never happened." I stared at it in my hand, shaking. My stomach twisted. My heart ached. How could she ask me to do this? How could she, another woman, another servant of God, treat my child like a shameful secret? I refused. I told her I wouldn't do it. That this was my baby. That I wouldn't be part of a sin like that. But she didn't argue. She just looked at me with disappointment and said, "You will do what is required. Or you will be removed, silenced, forgotten." I realized then that I wasn't just alone. I was trapped. Trapped in a place where obedience was demanded, where truth was buried, and where life, even innocent life, was disposable if it threatened their reputation. And that night, when they came for me, I knew they would not take no for an answer. They didn't take me to a hospital. There was no doctor, no prayer, no mercy. Instead, two of the elder sisters led me through a back hallway I had never walked before, a corridor cold and dimly lit, where the walls seemed to press in around me. I asked them where we were going, but they wouldn't answer. One of them held a set of old keys. The other carried a cloth bag. My feet were bare. My heart pounded. Every step felt like a betrayal of the promise I'd made to protect the life inside me. But I didn't scream. I didn't run. I was too numb, too broken. They brought me to a small stone room hidden beneath the chapel. A place I never knew existed. There was a cot, a basin of water, a rough wool blanket, and nothing else. The room smelled of mildew and rust. One of the sisters handed me the vial again. The same liquid. She didn't speak. Just nodded once, as if this was some unspoken rite we all must endure. I looked at it in my hands, trembling. I wanted to throw it against the wall. I wanted to cry out to God. But instead, I sat on the cot and held my belly. "I'm sorry," I whispered to the child I would never meet. "I didn't choose this. I never wanted this." I could feel the weight of generations of silence pressing down on me, all the other girls who had been forced into the same choice. Or worse. I wondered how many had sat in that same room, how many hearts had been shattered on that same cold stone floor, and how many had gone on pretending nothing ever happened. They didn't leave me alone. One sister stayed, sitting by the door with folded hands, watching, making sure I followed orders. I didn't drink the liquid. I couldn't. Hours passed. Then they came back with stronger hands. I won't describe what followed in detail, only that it wasn't medicine, it wasn't healing, and it wasn't mercy. It was a ritual of control, of domination, of spiritual violence dressed in discipline. And when it was over, I bled in silence, both from my body and from the place in my soul that used to believe in redemption. They left me there for 2 days. No light, no warmth, no prayer, just the cold sting of the stone beneath me and the steady ache inside my abdomen that reminded me of what they had taken. I wasn't given painkillers. No comfort. No words of compassion, only silence. And that silence screamed louder than any voice. I pressed my hands to my stomach again and again, as if searching for something that was no longer there. My body was empty, but the guilt, the pain, the grief, they were overflowing. I don't remember much of the second night. My mind floated between flashes of light and darkness, like I was sinking underwater. I remember whispering Hail Marys over and over, hoping that if I just prayed hard enough, the Virgin herself would come hold me. But no one came. Not Mary. Not God. Not even the sisters. When the door finally opened again, it wasn't to comfort me. It was to clean me. To make sure I looked presentable. To ensure I could return to the chapel like nothing had happened. When they brought me back upstairs, the morning bells were ringing. The sun was rising. Birds were chirping in the courtyard, and inside me, everything was dead. I walked slowly, through the halls, passing other sisters who smiled at me with warm eyes and soft voices. None of them knew. Or maybe some did. Maybe they had been through it too. Maybe that's why they looked at me with such quiet understanding. But none of them said a word. Because we all knew what happened to girls who spoke too loudly. The priest was gone. Just like that. Transferred to another parish, I was told. No explanation. No accountability. His absence was treated like a normal rotation, as if nothing had happened. And me. I was expected to return to my duties. Cleaning, praying, singing hymns with a mouth that still trembled. I did it all, but I was no longer the same girl. The light behind my eyes had dimmed. The fire in my heart had turned to ash. I wasn't a nun anymore. I was a tomb. A vessel that once carried life. And now carried only loss. For weeks, I moved through the convent like a shadow. I did what I was told. I smiled when spoken to. I knelt during prayer. I even sang. But inside, I was hollow, like something vital had been scraped out of me and never returned. I'd walk past the same stained glass windows I once found beautiful, and feel nothing. The light that used to inspire me now felt harsh, almost mocking. I stopped looking people in the eyes. I stopped looking in mirrors. I didn't recognize the woman behind the veil anymore. But it wasn't just grief, it was rage. It started quietly, like a small ember in my chest. But it grew with every step I took in silence. Every smile I was forced to give. Every lie I had to live. I began to resent the hymns we sang, the prayers we recited, the statues we knelt before, not because I had lost my faith, but because the people who claimed to protect that faith had used it as a weapon against me. They wore holiness like a costume, but underneath, they were cruel, cowardly, and complicit. And then something happened I didn't expect. Another sister came to me. She was young, barely 20. She waited until we were alone, then whispered, "I'm sorry for what they did to you." My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't told anyone. No one was supposed to know. But she looked at me with tears in her eyes, and I saw myself in her. That same fear. That same shame. That same desperate hunger for someone to say, "You're not crazy, you're not wrong. And it was never your fault." That was the moment everything changed. I realized I wasn't alone, that maybe there were more of us. That maybe this wasn't just my story, it was ours. And that's when I started to plan. I didn't know where I would go. I didn't have family anymore. No money. No identity outside these walls. But I knew I couldn't stay. If I stayed, I would become one of them, another silent face in the pews, another broken body in the name of obedience. I couldn't let that happen. I wouldn't, so I began writing letters. Hiding them under my mattress. Memorizing routines. Watching the gates. I studied every crack in the system, every opening, every blind spot. I prayed, but not for forgiveness. I prayed for strength. For one chance to reclaim my life. To escape the place that took everything from me. And one night, that chance came. It was a Thursday. The convent was quieter than usual because the bishop was expected the next morning, and everyone was busy preparing. That night, I pretended to be sick, asked to stay in my room and rest. No one questioned me. I had earned their trust over the years by being obedient, by being invisible. I waited until the bell struck midnight, then wrapped my rosary around my wrist like armor. slid the small satchel I had hidden beneath my bed over my shoulder, and crept through the halls barefoot, heart pounding like a drum inside my chest. I remember every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind that pushed against the old stained glass windows. My body shook, not just from fear, but from the weight of what I was about to do. I wasn't just leaving a building. I was leaving behind an identity, a vow, a lie that had wrapped itself so tightly around me I'd almost forgotten who I really was. But I knew if I didn't walk out that door tonight, I never would. I'd be swallowed whole, just like so many others had been. I slipped out through the side passage near the old pantry. I had memorized when the night guard would walk the outer courtyard, and I only had 90 seconds between his rounds. I pressed my back against the cold stone wall, watching the moonlight flicker across the gravel path ahead. When the moment came, I ran. Fast, silent, focused. I didn't stop until I reached the outer gate. It wasn't locked. They never thought anyone would try to leave. That was their mistake. The air outside was different. Sharper, freer. For the first time in years, I could smell trees, dirt, night flowers. It hit me all at once. I was outside. I was out. My knees buckled, and I dropped to the ground, trembling, sobbing, not just from relief, but from grief. I had no idea where I would go. I had no plan, but I had something I hadn't had in a long time: choice. And in that moment, even with the weight of everything I had lost, I knew I had chosen life. My own. Finally, it was a Thursday. The convent was quieter than usual because the bishop was expected the next morning, and everyone was busy preparing. That night, I pretended to be sick, asked to stay in my room and rest. No one questioned me. I had earned their trust over the years by being obedient, by being invisible. I waited until the bell struck midnight, then wrapped my rosary around my wrist like armor, slid the small satchel I had hidden beneath my bed over my shoulder, and crept through the halls barefoot, heart pounding like a drum inside my chest. I remember every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind that pushed against the old stained glass windows. My body shook, not just from fear, but from the weight of what I was about to do. I wasn't just leaving a building. I was leaving behind an identity, a vow, a lie that had wrapped itself so tightly around me I'd almost forgotten who I really was. But I knew if I didn't walk out that door tonight, I never would. I'd be swallowed whole, just like so many others had been. I slipped out through the side passage near the old pantry. I had memorized when the night guard would walk the outer courtyard, and I only had 90 seconds between his rounds. I pressed my back against the cold stone wall, watching the moonlight flicker across the gravel path ahead. When the moment came, I ran. Fast, silent, focused. I didn't stop until I reached the outer gate. It wasn't locked. They never thought anyone would try to leave. That was their mistake. The air outside was different, sharper, freer. For the first time in years, I could smell trees, dirt, night flowers. It hit me all at once. I was outside. I was out. My knees buckled, and I dropped to the ground, trembling, sobbing. Not just from relief, but from grief. I had no idea where I would go. I had no plan. But I had something I hadn't had in a long time: choice. And in that moment, even with the weight of everything I had lost, I knew I had chosen life, my own. Finally você disse: faça o próximo ChatGPT, disse ChatGPT. Rotarista, I didn't make it far that first night. I walked 4 miles, guided only by moonlight and desperation. My legs were weak. My stomach was empty. I hadn't eaten in over a day. But my will, that was the strongest it had ever been. Still, as the sun began to rise, my body gave in. I collapsed near a dirt road, on the outskirts of town. I remember lying there, unsure if I had escaped or just delayed the inevitable. For a moment, I closed my eyes and asked God, not for a miracle, but simply to be seen, to be found by someone who wouldn't send me back. And someone did find me. She was an older woman, maybe in her 70s, with silver hair and a voice that was both stern and gentle. Her name was Martha. She was on her way to the farmer's market when she saw me lying by the road. She pulled her truck over, helped me into the front seat, and didn't ask questions right away. She simply said, "You look like you've been running from something wholly awful. Don't worry, I've seen worse." And just like that, for the first time in years, I felt safe. Martha took me to her home, a small farmhouse on the edge of a quiet town in Texas. She let me sleep in her guest room for 3 days straight. She fed me soup, gave me clothes, and left the door open in case I wanted to talk. I didn't at first. I was afraid. Of her. Of the world. Of myself. But eventually, I broke. One evening, sitting on her porch as the sky turned pink, I told her everything. I expected her to look at me with pity or judgment. But she didn't, she just listened. When I finished, she reached over, squeezed my hand, and said, "Then it's time to start again." And that's exactly what I did. With her help, I got papers, a new name. A job cleaning rooms at a roadside inn. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest, and it was mine. I began to rebuild, piece by piece, trying to find myself beyond the veil, beyond the shame, beyond the memory of what they did to me. But even in freedom, I still carried the weight of the life I lost. My child. The one they took from me. Some nights I'd dream of a tiny heartbeat, and wake up with tears soaking my pillow. Because you never really stop being a mother, even when you never got the chance to be one. The years passed, but the ache inside me never did. I learned to smile again, to breathe without fear, to walk in sunlight without flinching at every shadow. Martha became like family to me, the kind I never had. She never asked me to forget what happened. She just reminded me that surviving it didn't make me weak. It made me free. And in that quiet corner of Texas, surrounded by dusty roads and distant skies, I began to reclaim pieces of myself. Not the girl who entered the convent, but the woman who walked away from it, scarred. Yes, but still standing. I stayed off the radar. I avoided churches. I never wore a cross again. For a long time, I couldn't even say the word faith without choking on it. But slowly, gently, something inside me began to shift. Not the kind of faith I once had, the blind devotion, the unquestioning trust. No, this was something different. A quiet belief that maybe God had never left me. That maybe He was never in that convent to begin with. Maybe He was here, in the kindness of a stranger. In Martha's soup, in the way the wind touched my face when I cried. Maybe I had been looking in the wrong places all along. And then one day, I met another woman, younger than me, nervous, polite. She recognized me from the town store. We began to talk. Eventually, she confided in me. Her story wasn't the same, but the pain in her eyes was she had been hurt. Silenced, disbelieved. I listened. Just like Martha listened to me. And when she finished, I said the words I wish someone had told me years ago. I believe you. It wasn't your fault. And you're not alone. That's when I knew I couldn't stay quiet anymore. That what happened to me, the horror, the silence, the injustice, it wasn't just my burden to carry. It was a truth that needed to be told, for the ones still inside those walls. For the ones who never made it out. For the child I lost. And for the voice I finally found. That's why I'm telling you this now. Not for sympathy, not for pity, but because someone out there needs to know that even in the darkest night, there is a way out, and there is life on the other side of silence. Herring, my story wasn't easy. It meant reopening wounds I had buried deep. It meant remembering details I wished I could forget. But I knew I had to do it. Not just for me, but for every woman still trapped in systems that claim holiness while hiding evil. So I began to write. At first, it was just in a journal, words scribbled late at night when the nightmares came. Then, with Martha's encouragement, I started recording voice notes. I couldn't believe how much poured out of me once I started. Years of silence cracked wide open, and in those cracks, something new began to grow. Courage. Eventually, I found the strength to speak publicly. I contacted an advocacy group that helped women who had survived abuse within religious institutions. They listened to my story, asked if I wanted to testify. At first, I hesitated. Fear came rushing back. Fear of judgment, of being labeled a liar, a disgrace, a traitor to the church. But then I thought of the others. Of the younger sister who whispered, "I'm sorry for what they did to you." Of the lives still in danger. Of my child. And I said, yes. I stood in front of a room full of strangers and told the truth. My voice shook. My hands trembled. But I didn't stop, and as I spoke, I saw faces change. Some cried, some looked away. Others stared in silent rage. And when I finished, the room was quiet. No applause, no noise, just a heavy, holy silence. Not the kind I knew in the convent, but one that honored truth instead of hiding it. Afterwards, women came up to me. Some hugged me. Some whispered, "Me too." And I realized I wasn't just healing myself anymore. I was helping others begin their healing too. Word spread. Others came forward. Some from the same order, some from other convents, other countries. My story became a spark, small, but enough to ignite something bigger. And though justice didn't come overnight, change began. Investigations were launched. That priest's name surfaced again, not just in my story, but in others. The church couldn't ignore it anymore. For the first time, I felt like my voice mattered. Like the truth had weight. And it was no longer just mine to carry it, was ours. Today, I live far from the walls that once imprisoned me. I have a small home, a quiet life, and for the first time, peace. Real peace, not the kind forced through silence or shame, but the kind earned through truth. I wake up each morning and see the sky, and I remember what it felt like not to have windows. I drink coffee on my porch and smile at the sunrise, and I remember what it felt like to live in the shadows. I still carry scars. I still have nights where the memories return without warning, but I'm not afraid of them anymore. Because those scars remind me that I survived, and that survival, in itself, is sacred. Sometimes I visit shelters or speak in small community centers. I don't wear the veil anymore, but I still carry the spirit of who I was. I speak not as a former nun, not even as a victim, but as a woman who knows what it means to be silenced, and what it means to fight for your voice. And every time I share my story, I feel the weight lift just a little more. Not because the past disappears, but because with every word I speak, I reclaim it. I turn pain into purpose, grief into guidance, silence into strength. And to the ones still inside, the ones watching this, maybe from behind a locked door or a heavy gate, I want to say this. You are not alone. What happened to you is not your fault. You are not dirty, you are not broken. You are not weak. You are worthy of love, of freedom, of healing. And even if the whole world tells you to stay quiet, even if they threaten you with shame or exile or damnation, your truth is more powerful than their lies. Your story matters. Just like mine does. This is not just a confession. It's a declaration. I was abused inside the church. I was forced to carry shame that was never mine. I was silenced, erased, and nearly destroyed. But I am still here. I speak not from a place of bitterness, but from hard-earned clarity. If I could survive what they did to me, so can you. And one day, when you're ready, I hope you'll tell your story too. Because only when we speak, only when we share, only when we stop hiding can we begin to truly heal. If you've made it this far, if you've listened to my voice and felt even a flicker of pain, anger, or recognition, thank you. It means you heard me. And being heard, truly heard, is something I once thought I'd never experience again. But here I am. Not just surviving, but living. Not just remembering, but rebuilding. And I want you to know, it's possible. It's possible to walk out of hell and still find beauty, still find joy, still find yourself. I used to think my life ended inside that convent, that when they took my child, when they took my dignity, they also took my future. But I was wrong. Because the truth is, they only have power if we let them keep our stories locked away. And I won't let them, not anymore. My voice was stolen once. Now, it's louder than ever, and I will use it for me, for the child I lost, for every girl and woman who was ever told to keep quiet in the name of God. So, if you're watching this, and you've experienced something similar, if you're still inside, still carrying your secret, still wondering if anyone would ever believe you, I believe you, and I hope one day, you believe yourself too. You don't have to be perfect to be free. You don't have to be fearless to escape. You just have to take the first step even if you're trembling, even if it feels impossible. That's how healing begins, not with a roar, but with a whisper that says, I deserve more than this. Thank you for allowing me to share what so many tried to silence. Thank you for standing with me, even just by listening. And please, don't let this story end here. Share it, talk about it. Look at the institutions we've been taught to trust and ask the hard questions, because the more light we shine on these hidden places, the harder it becomes for evil to hide in the name of holiness. This was my truth. Now it belongs to you too. Carry it with care. Carry it with courage. And never stop speaking. Before I end this, there's one last thing I need to say, something I never got the chance to tell the person who caused all this, to the man who wore a collar not to serve God, but to satisfy himself. You didn't destroy me, you tried. You took what you wanted. You thought your title, your robe, your reputation would protect you, and for a long time, it did. But not anymore. Your power was built on silence, and I've broken mine. You'll never again be just a priest in my memory. You'll always be what you truly were, a predator hiding behind sacred walls. But I'm not speaking to him for revenge. I'm speaking to remind myself and anyone listening that truth endures. And so does the human spirit. Even when it's beaten, betrayed, buried, it rises. That's what I've done. I've risen. From ashes. From trauma. From a convent that tried to make me invisible. I am no longer invisible. I am here. And I am never going back into the dark. There's so much I lost. My innocence. My trust. My child. But in telling this story, I've reclaimed something even more sacred. Myself. I am more than what they did to me. I am more than the robe I wore, or the vows I made. I am not defined by their sin, I am defined by my survival. And no matter how hard they try to erase me, I will not be forgotten. If you've been through something like this, please don't stay alone in your pain. There are people who will believe you. People who will stand beside you. People who have walked the same dark roads and made it out the other side. And if you're one of the lucky ones who hasn't known this kind of suffering, listen, don't turn away. Don't pretend these things don't happen. Because they do. In the quietest halls. In the holiest places. And the only way we stop them is by refusing to stay quiet. Thank you for hearing me. Thank you for letting this truth live outside my body. For the first time in years, I feel whole. And I hope, wherever you are, you find that wholeness too. After I told my story, something inside me finally began to settle. Not disappear, because pain like this never fully goes away, but settle. Like a storm that has passed and left behind a sky that is no longer violent, just heavy with memory. I began to breathe deeper. I began to sleep through the night. And most of all, I began to dream again, not the haunting dreams of the convent, but quiet ones. Dreams of building something new from the ruins. Because when we survive something like this, we don't just move on, we rebuild. We take the ashes and we shape them into something that can hold light again. I started writing letters to the girls still inside. Not real letters, I couldn't send them. But in each one, I wrote what I wished someone had told me. I told them they weren't alone. That they didn't deserve to carry shame that didn't belong to them. That love, real love, doesn't manipulate or violate or silence. And even if they couldn't leave right now, even if they were still trapped, there was a future beyond the gates. A life waiting that didn't demand silence or obedience, but simply truth. And one day, I wrote a letter to my child. The one they didn't let me have. I sat under a tree in Martha's backyard, tears on my cheeks, the wind in my hair, and I said everything I had never said aloud. I told them I was sorry. That I wanted them. That I loved them, even before they had a name. That the world we live in is sometimes cruel, but that they were never a mistake. That their life, even if brief, mattered. I buried the letter under that tree. And for the first time, I felt peace. Not closure, not justice, but peace. That moment taught me something. Healing doesn't come all at once. It's not a straight path. Some days I feel strong. Others I still fall apart. But I keep walking. And every step I take is one more they couldn't take from me. Every breath is a quiet rebellion against the silence they forced on me. And every word I share here now is proof that they failed. I'm still here, still telling the truth, still refusing to be erased. With each passing month, I realized my voice had become something greater than I expected, not a scream of anger, but a lifeline for others. Survivors from across the country started reaching out. Some had been nuns. Others had been young parishioners. Many had never told anyone before. They spoke in whispers, through emails, handwritten letters, or anonymous calls. But in every word, I heard the same familiar pain, the pain of being violated, then silenced. The pain of betrayal wrapped in sacred cloth, so I began to document it all. Not as a journalist, but as a witness. I kept records, created time, tracked names. It started with just one folder, but soon, I had stacks of stories, photos, testimonies. Some of them were decades old. Others were recent. Some victims were still inside, waiting for the right moment to escape. Some never would, but they trusted me with their truth, and I vowed I would carry it with care. Because for so long, we had been forced to carry that pain alone. I partnered with advocacy organizations and independent investigators. One day, I was invited to speak on a panel alongside 2 other survivors, both of whom had also been forced into silence by clergy members. We shared our stories on stage, with cameras rolling, and for the first time, the church was forced to respond. They issued statements, denials, apologies that sounded hollow. But the public pressure was growing. People were finally listening, and more importantly, believing it wasn't about vengeance. It was about visibility, about refusing to be erased, about making sure the next young girl who walked through the doors of a convent knew that her voice mattered. That God was not found in the hands that hurt her, but in her ability to rise. And through it all, I kept remembering that child I lost, that tiny heartbeat that never got to live a life. In every truth I spoke, I was honoring them. In every survivor I helped, I was mothering in the only way I could. That's when I knew this was my calling now. Not a vow made in fear or naivety, but a purpose born through fire. I would not be a nun anymore. I would be a witness, a protector, a reminder that even the darkest places cannot keep light from breaking in. Eventually, the story gained national attention. A journalist, a woman with sharp eyes and a voice full of empathy, reached out to me. She had seen one of my recorded talks and asked if I'd be willing to participate in a documentary about abuse in religious institutions. My first instinct was to decline. I was still afraid of the backlash. The church had power, after all, influence in politics, in media, in entire communities, but then I remembered how long I had waited for someone to tell my story, and how many women never got the chance to tell theirs. We spent months filming. The documentary crew followed me through my daily life, through the letters I still received, through the town where I rebuilt my existence. They even visited the gate of the old convent. I didn't go in, but I stood outside and looked at the building that once swallowed me whole, and for the first time, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel powerless. I stood on the other side of those walls as a woman reborn, and when the camera rolled, I spoke as someone who had lost everything and still found the strength to live again. When the film was released, everything changed. I received hundreds, no, thousands of messages. Some from victims. Some from people who had never stepped inside a church, but were shaken to their core by the truth. And then came the letters from within the church itself, some supportive, others filled with anger, even threats. But I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Because for every attempt to silence me, there were 10 voices rising beside mine. The truth was out now, and it couldn't be buried again. Even as I celebrated that small victory, I stayed grounded. I never wanted fame. I didn't want to be a symbol. I just wanted to make sure no other woman endured what I did in secret, in silence, with no one to hold her afterward. So I kept going, speaking, writing, holding the hands of others who were just beginning their own escape. I wasn't just telling my story, I was building a bridge out of the darkness, brick by brick, voice by voice, until one day, we wouldn't need to escape anymore, because no one would be caged in the first place. With time, I found myself in places I never imagined. University halls, human rights conferences, even church reform forums, spaces where my voice once smothered behind sacred walls, now echoed freely. And every time I stood to speak, I reminded them, I am not here to attack faith. I am here to defend the truth. Because what happened to me wasn't about belief, it was about power. Abuse doesn't flourish in darkness by accident, it thrives, because institutions protect their own. Even when their own are wolves in holy garments. At one conference, I sat on a panel beside former clergy who had left after witnessing similar horrors. One of them, an elderly priest, said with tears in his eyes, "We failed you." And for a moment, I didn't feel rage. I felt release. Because someone had finally said it, not behind closed doors. Not as a whispered confession, but out loud, in front of an audience. And that simple acknowledgement meant more than 1,000 empty apologies. Because accountability is where healing begins, not silence. I never returned to a convent. I never wore the veil again. But I found a new way to live out what I once believed was my purpose, serving others. Not through obedience or hierarchy, but through truth, advocacy, and care. I started a support network, a private space where women like me could come together, share their stories, and rebuild. Some of them were still wearing habits. Others had long since left. But all of us were survivors. All of us had once believed the lie that our pain was a test from God. Now we knew better. Sometimes, late at night, I sit outside and look at the stars. I think of the girl I was when I entered the convent, young, hopeful, naive. I mourn her, I love her, and I forgive her. Because she believed in something pure. Something sacred. And though others tried to twist that belief into a cage, I took it back. I turned it into something honest. Something brave. Something free. And if that isn't holy, then I don't know what is. Years after my escape, I received an anonymous envelope, no return address. Inside was a photograph, faded, black and white, of a group of nuns standing in the convent courtyard. I was in the background, barely visible. But I recognized the others instantly, and taped to the back was a small note, handwritten, "There are still so many of us." My hands trembled as I read it. My chest tightened. It was a message not of fear, but of hope. A silent reminder that the battle wasn't over. And that the ones still trapped hadn't forgotten me. That envelope reignited something in me. I realized my story wasn't just about looking back, it was about looking for those still inside. I began organizing outreach through trusted networks. Secret safe houses, code names, emergency contacts. It was dangerous, but necessary. We weren't just telling stories anymore. We were rescuing lives. Some of the women we helped escape were barely 18. Others were in their 50s. Women who had spent their entire adult lives behind cloistered walls, convinced that silence was sainthood. One woman, I'll call her Sister Claire, broke my heart in ways I didn't think were possible anymore. She had endured decades of spiritual manipulation, emotional blackmail, and sexual abuse by the very same man who once hurt me. She hadn't spoken to her family in over 30 years. She believed she would die inside that convent. But when we met, when she looked me in the eyes and said, "I thought I was the only one," I knew we were doing something bigger than justice. We were restoring souls. These women weren't just victims. They were survivors. Warriors, and each one carried a story that deserved to be heard. I started compiling their testimonies with consent into a collection. One day, I hope to publish it. Not to sensationalize our pain, but to memorialize our courage. Because no institution, no collar, no title, no doctrine should be immune to truth. The church may try to erase us from their records, but we are writing our own, page by page, voice by voice, and this time, we will not be silenced. I often think about how different my life could have been if someone had spoken out before me. If someone had warned me, if someone had believed me the first time I cried in silence. But the past cannot be rewritten. What can be rewritten is the ending. And I made a vow to myself, one more sacred than any I ever took behind a chapel door, that I would make sure no one else had to walk through that same darkness alone again. The network we built began to grow. Former nuns, priests who had left, lawyers, counselors, even journalists who once doubted our claims came forward to help. It wasn't a movement funded by power. It was fueled by pain, by truth, by survivors. And with every story shared, with every woman rescued, the lie began to crack. The lie that these places were always holy. That obedience is always virtue. That silence is always sacred. No, we shattered that illusion with every act of truth. But we also faced resistance. Powerful people don't surrender their control easily. Some of us were threatened, tracked, discredited. I even received letters warning me to stop spreading corruption. They called me bitter, called me a traitor, said I was destroying faith. But I never set out to destroy faith. I set out to protect it from being twisted into a weapon. Because real faith doesn't hide predators. It protects the innocent. And I refused to let fear win again. I began visiting shelters where runaway girls were taken in. Some had never been in a convent, but their eyes told the same story. I'd sit with them, not as a mentor, but as an equal. We'd talk, cry, sometimes just sit in silence. And, often, they'd ask me the same question. How did you survive? And I always gave the same answer, because I finally believed that I deserved to. That was the turning point. Not the night I escaped. Not the day I spoke. But the moment I looked in the mirror and chose myself. Not guilt, not fear, not obedience. Me. And that's the message I carry now, wherever I go. To every woman, every girl, every soul who's ever felt trapped in silence. You are allowed to choose yourself. Even if they call it rebellion. Even if they say it's sin. Even if the whole world tells you to kneel, stand anyway, because freedom, once tasted, becomes something you'll never forget. And once you find your voice, there's no going back. Not long ago, I returned to the city where the convent once stood. I didn't go back to the building itself. It had been closed, locked down after the investigations began. No more hymns from the chapel. No more footsteps echoing down the cold stone corridors. Just silence, a haunting one. But I didn't come for closure. I came to speak at a nearby university to a packed auditorium of students, activists, clergy, and survivors. They invited me not as a victim, but as a voice. A voice that once trembled, and now refused to be silenced. I stepped on that stage with my heart pounding, but I looked out into that crowd and saw something I never thought I would. Hope. People ready to listen. To learn, to change. I told them my story, but I didn't end with the pain. I ended with the rebuild. With the sisterhood that rose from the ashes. With the women who escaped and now held others' hands as they ran. And when I finished, the applause wasn't polite, it was thunderous. Not for me, but for every woman who ever dared to speak when the world told her to stay quiet. After the talk, a young girl came up to me. She was shaking. Said she'd grown up in a strict Catholic household, had been considering entering a convent herself. But my story made her stop and ask questions she'd never dared to ask. I didn't tell her what to do. I just looked her in the eyes and said, "Whatever you choose, make sure it's for you, and make sure you're never silenced." She hugged me so tight I couldn't breathe. And in that moment, I knew that everything, every scar, every sleepless night, had been worth it, because we aren't just breaking silence, we're building legacy. A legacy of truth, of defiance, of healing. And it doesn't end with me. It continues every time someone watches this video. Every time someone whispers "me too" behind closed doors. Every time another woman chooses her freedom. I was once just a girl who wanted to serve God. They tried to take everything from me. But I took it back and gave it a voice. This voice, right here, right now. And I will never be silent again. I started writing not to publish, not to share, but just to release. Each night, I sat with a pen in my hand and let the memories pour onto the page. I wrote everything. The things I remembered. The things I feared I had imagined. The prayers I used to whisper in the dark. The screams I swallowed down so no one would hear. I didn't try to make it pretty. I didn't care about grammar. I just needed to get it out. And the more I wrote, the lighter I felt, like I was finally breathing for the first time in years. But something strange began to happen. As I reread the pages, I saw someone I hadn't noticed before myself. Not the broken girl. Not the obedient sister. But the version of me who survived. The woman who endured unspeakable things and still woke up every morning, still dared to speak, still found ways to love and hope. For the first time, I saw her not as a victim, but as someone powerful, someone worth listening to, someone who could help others do the same. That's when I realized this story couldn't stay in the dark anymore. Not just my story, but the truth about what happens inside those walls. The untold stories of girls who never made it out. Of pregnancies covered in shame. Of forced silence dressed up as spiritual obedience. I had to do something more than speak. I had to act. Because, while I was healing, others were still being hurt, and I couldn't live with myself if I didn't try to stop it. So I reached out to a publisher. Not a big company. Just a small, independent press that specialized in survivor voices. I sent them a sample of what I'd written. Just a few pages. I didn't expect a reply. But within a week, I had one. The editor wrote, "This is the most haunting, powerful thing I've read in years. Let's talk." And that's when I knew. The world was finally ready to hear what the church tried to bury. When the book was finally published, I was trembling, not with excitement, but with fear. Fear of backlash. Fear of judgment. Fear that people would call me a liar, say I was exaggerating, accuse me of slandering the church. For years, I had been taught that truth was something to whisper. That suffering was part of holiness. That exposing abuse was more sinful than the abuse itself. But now, my truth was printed, bound between two covers, and released into the world. There was no going back. In the first few days, I avoided reading any comments. I didn't check emails or social media. I just waited. But then, the messages started coming in. Not hate, support. Women who cried reading their own stories in mine. Men who wrote to apologize for never believing their sisters, their daughters, their wives. Even members of the clergy, priests, nuns, ex-seminarians, who confessed that they had witnessed things and stayed silent out of fear. My words, born in isolation, had sparked something. A fire, a movement. A reckoning. Soon, independent media began reaching out. Podcasts, online magazines, grassroots documentaries. And for the first time, I said yes without hesitation. Not because I craved attention, but because this truth wasn't mine to keep anymore. Every time I sat in front of a microphone, I imagined the girl preparing to enter a convent. The one who still thought faith meant submission. I wanted her to hear me and know. Know that silence is not holiness. That survival is not sin. Then, something unexpected happened. One of my interviews went viral. National television picked it up. Millions watched. And that night, as my face appeared on screens across the country, something shifted. The silence broke. The church responded. Of course, carefully worded statements, vague apologies, denials, but this time, it wasn't enough. Because I wasn't alone anymore. Because the public had heard the truth straight from me. And once the truth is heard, really heard, it can't be buried again. After the interview aired nationwide, I received more letters and messages than I could count. Some came from survivors thanking me for speaking what they were still too afraid to say. Others came from people who once turned a blind eye and were now reckoning with the guilt. But then came the letters that chilled me, anonymous threats, warnings to stop talking, accusations of destroying the church or leading souls astray. They arrived, typed, unsigned, postmarked from cities I'd never been to. At first, they shook me. Then, they strengthened me. Because if the truth scared them enough to threaten me, it meant they were listening. And I knew I couldn't stop. I contacted authorities, made sure I was protected, but I didn't go into hiding. That part of my life, the hiding, was over. Instead, I became louder, bolder. I joined panels on institutional abuse. I worked with nonprofits helping women escape religious captivity. I even testified in front of a human rights committee, holding nothing back. And as I spoke, I watched as lawmakers, activists, and even priests lowered their eyes in shame. One of the most powerful moments came during a closed-door session with church investigators. They had no cameras, no press, just me, a panel of officials, and a quiet room. They asked me to recount everything again. I did, in detail. I spoke of the abuse, the manipulation, the forced abortion, the complicity of those who watched it all unfold and said nothing. When I finished, the room was silent. One man, a bishop, whispered, "We failed you." And for the first time, I believed that someone within their walls actually meant it. But it wasn't enough. A whisper of remorse wouldn't undo the decades of silence, so I pushed for action. I demanded public acknowledgement, compensation for survivors, access to sealed records, real accountability, not just prayers and press statements. And slowly, painfully, change began. Policies were reviewed. Leaders were replaced. Investigations reopened. It was a start. Not justice, not healing, but a start. And for the women still waiting in the dark, even a crack in the wall meant hope. And hope is how revolutions begin. As the movement gained traction, I found myself surrounded by women who carried similar scars. Some older than me, who had endured decades of silence. Some much younger, still processing the confusion between what they were taught to believe and what had been done to them behind closed doors. We formed a circle not just of support, but of resistance. A quiet, powerful rebellion rooted not in anger alone, but in shared survival. We called ourselves the Daughters of Truth. And we vowed to never let what happened to us happen in silence again. Together, we built something I never imagined I'd be part of, a sanctuary that didn't require submission, didn't demand silence, didn't punish doubt. We created a network of safe houses for women leaving religious institutions. We provided lawyers, therapists, even transition counselors to help them build new lives. Some of these women had never held a debit card, had never lived outside church property, had no idea how to rent an apartment or file a job application. The church had been their world, and leaving meant stepping into the unknown. But what struck me most wasn't the fear, it was the strength. These women, some barely able to speak at first, slowly reclaimed their voices. I watched as a former nun who hadn't spoken above a whisper in years, stood before a room full of strangers and said, "I was told my body was a vessel for sin. But now I know it's mine." That moment, that sentence shook me. Because it echoed everything I had fought to rediscover in myself. And now it was spreading, one woman at a time, like fire through dry grass. We started documenting their stories carefully, with consent, some anonymously, and sharing them online. The reaction was overwhelming. Thousands of views, thousands of messages. People from all over the world began sending their own stories. Some from within convents, some from other countries, some from men who had suffered under similar hierarchies. We were no longer isolated victims. We were a movement. And the church, once untouchable, was being held accountable by the very women it once tried to erase. And the truth was louder than ever. But amidst all the strength, all the public speaking, and all the progress, there were still moments of quiet collapse. Healing doesn't move in a straight line. Some nights, I would lie in bed and feel like that scared 19-year-old girl, again, alone, bleeding, praying for a miracle that never came. The body remembers what the mind tries to forget. Certain smells, certain hymns, even the way a door clicked shut could send me spiraling. I had to remind myself that pain returning doesn't mean I've failed, it means I'm still healing. And healing, I've learned, is a lifelong vow. There was one night I'll never forget. I was speaking at a small women's conference in a town I had never visited before. After the session, a girl approached me. She was probably no older than 20, wearing jeans and a hoodie, eyes puffy like she'd been crying for days. She didn't say anything at first, just handed me a folded piece of paper and walked away. I opened it later in my hotel room. It read, "You just saved my life." I was going back to him. I thought God wanted me to. Now I know better. I held that note in my hands for a long time. It was a reminder of why I kept going. Why I kept speaking, even when my voice trembled. Why I exposed my deepest wounds to strangers. Not for attention. Not for revenge. But because somewhere out there are still girls being told that obedience is love, that silence is holiness. That pain is part of the calling. And if my voice, scarred and weathered as it is, can reach them before it's too late, then every painful memory becomes something sacred, so I kept going. City after city, podcast after podcast, school after school. Each time I felt like I was stitching together the girl I used to be, piece by piece, word by word. The convent had taken everything from me, my innocence, my trust, my future, but it hadn't taken my soul. That I reclaimed. That I now wore with pride. And with every story I told, I invited others to do the same, because freedom is not just the absence of chains, it's the ability to speak your truth, even if your voice shakes. As more stories came to light, and as the community of survivors grew louder, so did the resistance. Not from the public. They were largely on our side now, but from the institution itself. Certain dioceses began releasing carefully crafted statements, denying involvement, distancing themselves from the men we named. They called our movement an attack on faith. They painted us as bitter, lost, sinful women. But I knew that was a tactic, a desperate attempt to shift focus from the crimes to our character. And we were prepared. We had documentation now. Letters, photos, medical records, testimonies, evidence that couldn't be dismissed or denied. And we began organizing legal efforts, class action lawsuits, international petitions, even pressure on the Vatican. The Church, once protected by centuries of secrecy and reverence, was being confronted by something it couldn't control, the truth from within. Because we weren't outsiders trying to dismantle faith, we were insiders, women who had once given our lives to it, and our betrayal didn't begin with our words, it began with theirs. Still, that pressure came with a price. I started noticing strange cars parked outside my home. My emails were being flagged. My phone rang at odd hours, always silent on the other end. I couldn't prove it, but I knew someone was watching, trying to intimidate me, make me stop. But here's the thing about survivors. Once you've had your body, your will, your voice stolen, fear changes. It doesn't disappear, but it no longer owns you. And instead of retreating, I leaned in even harder. I hired security when needed, moved apartments. But I didn't cancel a single event. If they wanted me to be afraid, they'd have to do more than lurk in the shadows, because the light was already spreading in every headline, every live stream, every woman who stood up and said, "It happened to me too." We were no longer whispering, we were shouting. And the louder we got, the more impossible it became to ignore us. They tried to silence one woman, but now, they were facing thousands. The wave we created was no longer just a movement, it was a reckoning. News outlets that had once ignored these stories began dedicating entire specials to what they now called the voices of the veil. Journalists reached out to survivors in multiple countries. A global map of abuse began to form, connecting convents and parishes like a haunting network. It was no longer isolated, no longer rare. The stories we told had cracked something open, and what spilled out was centuries of silence. Now impossible to contain, but with the attention came the emotional weight, heavier than I ever imagined. I received thousands of letters from women, each carrying their own burden, hoping I could somehow hold a part of it for them. Some messages were barely readable, typed with shaking hands, recounting horrors far worse than mine. I cried reading them. I screamed. Sometimes I had to close my laptop and just sit in the dark, breathing, grounding myself so I didn't drown in their pain. Because for every story I told publicly, there were 100 more that would never be heard. One woman's story, in particular, stayed with me. She had spent over 20 years in a convent in South America. Abused by her spiritual director, isolated from her family, and threatened with excommunication if she ever spoke. She escaped by faking a mental breakdown, the only way they would let her leave. Her message ended with, "Your voice gave me mine. I'm no longer afraid." I printed that email and kept it taped beside my desk. Every time I questioned my strength, I looked at it and remembered why I started. That's when I realized this wasn't just about telling my story anymore. It was about amplifying theirs. So we started a foundation, The Veil Uncovered. Its mission was simple: fund therapy, housing, and legal aid for women leaving religious abuse. We launched a helpline. We created safe spaces, both physical and digital. And within months, hundreds of survivors had come forward seeking help. We weren't just exposing injustice. We were building a new path out of it. One paved with truth, healing, and finally, hope. As the veil uncovered grew, so did our visibility. Major universities began inviting us to speak, not just in theology departments, but in law schools, psychology conferences, even human rights symposiums. Our stories were no longer seen as isolated tragedies, they were being studied as evidence of systemic abuse, institutional gaslighting, and religious coercion. I stood on stages I never imagined stepping on, in rooms full of professors and policymakers who once thought these stories were too taboo to address. And yet, there they were, listening, taking notes, asking questions. It was empowering, but also terrifying, because with every audience, the responsibility grew heavier. I wasn't just a survivor anymore, I had become a symbol. And I'll be honest, some days, that weight was unbearable. People looked at me as if I had all the answers, as if healing had made me invincible. But healing isn't a straight road. Some mornings, I still woke up shaking. Some nights, I cried myself to sleep. I wasn't a heroine. I was a human. A woman who had been shattered, and was still piecing herself back together. One night after a speaking engagement in New York, a journalist asked me, "Do you ever wish you had stayed silent?" I paused. It wasn't the first time someone had asked. But this time, I looked him straight in the eyes and said, "I wish I had never needed to speak at all. I wish what happened to me, to all of us, never needed to be exposed." But silence was killing us. And truth saved my life. He didn't say a word. He just nodded. I think, in that moment, even he felt the weight of what we were carrying. And the truth is, I didn't set out to be a fighter. I didn't choose this path. But once I saw what was buried behind those convent walls, I couldn't unsee it. I couldn't walk away and pretend it wasn't happening, because while the church protected predators, the rest of us were left to pick up the pieces. And I had decided long ago, I would no longer pick up those pieces in silence. I would do it with my voice, with my story. And now, with an army of survivors behind me, there came a day, I remember it vividly, when a Vatican official finally requested a private meeting with me. Not a recorded interview, not a public hearing. A closed-door conversation. I hesitated. My first instinct was to say no. I didn't owe them anything. Not after what they allowed. Not after the silence they maintained. But something inside me said, "Go, let them look you in the eye." So I flew to Rome. Alone. No entourage, no press, just me and the weight of every story I carried. The meeting was held in a quiet office tucked deep inside the Apostolic Palace. The man who greeted me wasn't in robes or ceremonial dress. He was plain, serious, tired-looking, maybe even ashamed. He thanked me for coming, and then, with a shaky voice, said, "We failed you." It was almost word for word what that bishop had told me years earlier, but this time, I interrupted. "No," I said. "You didn't fail me. You protected him." The words hung in the air like thunder. He didn't respond. He couldn't. I laid out everything. From the abuse, to the forced abortion, to the threats and cover-ups. I gave him names, dates, documents. I told him about the other survivors, the ones too afraid to speak, the ones who died carrying their silence. He listened, nodding, occasionally scribbling notes. But I wasn't there for apologies. I was there for action. So I ended with this: if the church really wants redemption, it needs to confess, not to God, but to the people it abandoned. He said they would review everything, that they were opening investigations, that they took it seriously. But I'd heard those words before. And I wasn't going to wait on promises. What mattered now wasn't what the church would say, but what we, the survivors, would do. We no longer needed permission to speak. We were speaking, loudly, globally, and now, even the Vatican had to listen. Maybe for the first time in history, they were forced to, because we had taken back what they stole: our truth, our dignity, and our power. After the Vatican meeting, something in me shifted. I realized that no matter how many walls we shook, the real change, the most lasting one, wasn't going to come from inside those golden halls. It would come from us. From survivors who had turned pain into purpose. From women who, for years, had been silenced and were now writing books, filming documentaries, speaking in schools and courtrooms. We weren't just victims anymore. We were architects of a new future, one where no girl would ever suffer. Behind the veil of holy obedience again, I went back to the United States with a fire I hadn't felt in years. I expanded our network, partnered with lawyers working on international justice cases, and began helping other countries create their own branches of survivor coalitions. We started translating our materials into multiple languages: Spanish, French, Tagalog, Swahili, because this wasn't just a local problem, it was global. The same pattern: repeated isolation, indoctrination, abuse, cover-up. But now, we were connecting the dots across borders, across cultures, across continents. I watched as women in countries I'd never even visited began to rise up. Former nuns in Argentina, abused novices in Italy, ex-cloistered sisters in the Philippines. They wrote to me saying, "Your voice gave us permission to speak." And that made everything worth it. Every sleepless night, every threat, every moment I thought I couldn't go on. Because I had become more than just a witness. I had become a mirror, showing others that survival was not only possible, but powerful and contagious. At one international summit, a survivor from Poland stood on stage and said, "We don't need the church to save us. We are saving each other." The whole room erupted in applause. Tears streamed down my face. That moment summed up everything I had learned since escaping that convent: that healing doesn't come from silence. It comes from solidarity. And, together, we were rewriting a narrative centuries old, one confession at a time, one voice at a time, and the church could no longer ignore us, because we were everywhere now, and we were never going back. As the years passed, something extraordinary began to happen. Survivors who had once been too afraid to speak began leading their own communities. Women who had escaped decades of spiritual manipulation were now running shelters, teaching workshops, mentoring younger girls. Some even returned to their faith, but on their own terms, free from the chains of institutional control. Others walked away from religion entirely, choosing to rebuild their identity from the ground up, and both paths were valid. Because, finally, we had a choice, something we were never allowed inside those convent walls. I was invited to participate in a televised debate once, opposite a high-ranking church official. The producers wanted drama. But what happened surprised everyone. Instead of a heated argument, I told my story calmly. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I simply told the truth. The priest, sitting across from me, turned red, fumbled his words, tried to steer the conversation toward forgiveness. And that's when I looked into the camera and said, "Forgiveness without accountability is just another form of silence." The internet exploded. That clip was shared millions of times. And I knew people were finally understanding. The church began losing members in record numbers. Not because people stopped believing in God, but because they stopped believing in institutions that covered up evil. And yet, this wasn't about destroying faith, it was about reclaiming it. Separating spirituality from the structures that abused it. And in that separation, many found peace. Including me. I didn't need a habit or a rosary to connect with the divine. I had my voice, my truth, my sisters. That was sacred. People often ask me if I regret becoming a nun, if I could go back and undo it all. And while part of me wishes I had been spared the trauma, another part, a deeper, stronger part, knows that if I hadn't gone through it, I wouldn't be here today, helping others escape. I turned my pain into purpose, my silence into revolution. And every time another woman stands up and tells her truth, I know I made the right choice. because now, the veil is lifting. And behind it, there's light. One afternoon, I received a letter that stopped me cold. It was handwritten, elegant, almost too formal, the kind of script that made you pause before unfolding the page. It was from a young woman still inside a convent. She had secretly read my book, passed from hand to hand among the sisters, hidden beneath floorboards and behind hymnals. In her letter, she wrote, "They say what you did was evil. But I know you saved me." I thought I was crazy for the way he touched me. Now I know I'm not alone. I read that line over and over, because even after everything, the interviews, the speeches, the foundation, there were still girls inside, trapped in silence, living what I had lived, questioning their own reality, and depending on someone out here to show them another way. That letter reminded me that this work was far from over, that no matter how far we'd come, the system still existed, the walls still stood, and there were still hands pressed against them from the inside, begging to be heard. So I wrote her back, carefully, secretly. I didn't tell her to run or fight. I told her she was right, that what she felt mattered, that what happened to her was not her fault, that truth doesn't need permission to be spoken. I gave her the number to our foundation's encrypted hotline, and I prayed not to the church, not to a statue, but to whatever force in this universe still believes in justice, that she would make it out, that she would become part of this growing chorus, that she would live. And that's when it hit me. The story never ends. Not with me. Not with any one woman. Every time a new survivor finds their voice, the next chapter begins. We are writing a new gospel, not of saints and martyrs, but of women who refused to stay silent, women who rose from ashes, women who were told to kneel, and chose to stand. And now, with every story we tell, every name we say out loud, every truth we dare to share, we are lighting the path for the ones still inside. Because someone once lit it for us. In time, my story, our story reached places I never imagined. It became part of college curriculums, quoted in research papers, referenced in documentaries that won awards I never even knew existed. But none of that compared to the letters I continued to receive from women across the world, from cloisters in Italy, from orphanages in Ireland, from mission houses in Kenya. They weren't just writing to tell me what happened. They were writing to say thank you, because hearing one woman speak had given them permission to unbury decades of pain. But with that recognition came an unexpected moment. I was offered the chance to meet with the current Pope, a private audience. No press, no advisors. Just me, in the Vatican, in the heart of the very institution that had once tried to erase me. I wrestled with the decision for weeks. What could I say to a man who presided over an empire of both faith and silence? But eventually, I said yes. Not for closure, not for peace, but to look him in the eye and let him feel the weight of every woman who never got that chance. When I entered that small papal chamber, my hands were steady, my heart calm. I spoke clearly. I told him everything, not just what was done to me, but what continues to be done to women inside the walls of his church. I brought him letters from survivors. I placed them gently in front of him and said, "These are your flock too." He didn't deny it, he didn't defend it. He simply said, "I believe you." And for a moment, I saw the man beneath the robes, and I thought, maybe, just maybe, this is the beginning of real change. But I didn't leave that meeting with hope in a man. I left with hope in us, in women who keep pushing forward, in stories that refuse to be buried, in the truth that echoes louder than centuries of silence. I left knowing that we had already done what many thought was impossible. We broke through. We exposed what they said couldn't be exposed, and we're not done. Because there are still girls behind those convent gates, still hands reaching out, and we won't stop until every one of them is free. Today, when I look in the mirror, I no longer see the girl who walked through the convent gates, full of faith and fear. I see a woman rebuilt, not in spite of what was taken from her, but because of what she reclaimed. My voice, my story, my power. I carry scars, yes, but they are not marks of shame, they are proof that I survived, that I endured what was meant to destroy me. And now, those scars speak louder than any sermon ever preached from a pulpit. I often return to the place where it all began, not physically. I've never stepped foot inside that convent again, but in memory. I close my eyes and remember the sound of the bells, the scent of the chapel floor, the hollow silence of my cell at night. I remember the weight of obedience, the confusion of devotion twisted into control, The terrifying moment when I realized I was pregnant. And utterly alone. But I also remember the decision, the one that changed everything. The choice to speak. To stop protecting the men who hurt me, and start protecting the girl I used to be. That girl deserved better. And now, through this story, through this movement, I've made sure she'll never be forgotten. Her cries may have gone unheard then, but they echo now in every survivor's voice. In every policy changed. In every institution held accountable. We are no longer shadows behind stained glass. We are light bursting through it. We are the daughters of truth. The women who refuse to kneel. And no matter what they try to silence next, they will never silence us again. So if you're watching this, and you've been carrying your own pain in silence, hear me clearly. You are not alone. Your story matters. Your voice is powerful, and you deserve freedom, healing, and peace. If no one else has ever said it to you, let me be the first. I believe you. I see you, and you are worth saving. Always, because in the end, it was never just about me.